Hey guys, this is Blue Forest. I hope you're doing well. So today I'm beginning a video series where we are going to go over the signatures of the bots in the game by class. And so I want to do an overview. I'm going to talk about each signature, describe how they work. I'm going to give you a sense of what they look like at low sig, so sig 1 to 5, and then also give you a picture of what they look like at sig 100, because a lot of people don't know. A lot of people don't have any sig 100 bots of even lower tier bots, let alone 5 stars. It can take years to get even a single 5-star up to very high sig. And so I want to give you a sense of what these bots look like when their sigs are maxed out. And then we're also going to talk about things to think about when you're pouring those sigs into your bots, things like activation rate, because not all sigs are created equal. Some will activate much more often than others. Some will activate easily. Some will be triggered by certain kinds of attacks. Some require you to lose health. Some only activate once per fight or for a brief duration. Some are very RNG based. Some scale well, some don't. So there's a lot of things to think about. Okay, now I'm not going to rank these sigs. That's entirely up to you, and ultimately you should feed sigs into bots that you do well with, that you play a lot with, and so forth. But there are things to think about because there is a lot of variability within the sigs. They do not all operate the same way, and some are going to benefit you a lot more and more often than others will. Okay, so we're going to start with the warrior class, and we're going to start with Necro. So Necro, his signature is Outrage. So Outrage does two things. Number one, it doubles your Titan charge capacity from 20 to 40. That's very helpful because more Titan charges means more attack, more damage, but it also helps you to keep overwhelming power going for longer because you get those Titan charges up. You are going to be expending some of them when you do things like special attacks or if you get knocked down. So having more Titan charges allows you to keep overwhelming power going longer, which you want to do with Necro because that's where he really shines. So at sig 1, he is getting about 2%, so 1.9% additional crit damage when overwhelming power is active. That goes up to about 80%, just over 80% at sig 100. So it is a noticeable difference, okay? Now here's the thing. Even though at low sig, he's not getting a lot of extra crit damage, it's still a very, very worthwhile sig because it activates all the time. And if you're a really good player, you can have overwhelming power going for very long stretches of time. My Necro is at about sig 25, which gives him 20-something% additional crit damage. That's still significant, and Necro is a bot that crits a lot. He has a lot of big attacks, and so he does not need to be at high sig in order to derive a lot of benefit from the sig just because it's going to be activating very, very frequently. Obviously, if he's your top bot, if you use him all the time, you'd want to invest in his sig, but you're still going to see a lot of benefit from it, even at lower sig, just because overwhelming power is going to be active quite often when you're using him, and that's a good thing. So that brings us to Dirge. His sig is Grim Mockery. So Grim Mockery triggers when the opponent misses melee attacks while they're under the effect of fear. This is also a very good sig in that it has a very high activation rate because the opponent is often going to be under the effect of fear. They always start the fight with fear. It cannot be purified. It's only removed by, certain kinds of attacks and so forth. And so if you're a pretty good player, you don't get hit much, you know how to dodge, you're going to be able to activate this sig multiple times in a fight. In long fights, it could actually activate over and over again. And so when the opponent misses those attacks, at sig 1, Dirge is going to get a 10% attack boost for 5 seconds. Now, that's not very long, but it's certainly long enough to do some real damage. And, like I said, you can activate this repeatedly, and so it can certainly add up. That goes up to a 60% attack boost at sig 100, which is a pretty significant jump from 10%. Now, does Dirge need to be at high sig? No, of course not. He's a great bot. He's got a very comprehensive kit, but again, if you really love to use Dirge, because this is what this is really all about, choosing the bots that you do well with and so forth, it would be worth investing into his sig because it will activate very frequently and getting those attack boosts over and over again, especially when paired with all of the other bonuses that he's getting when the opponent has fear, that can mean a lot of extra damage over time. So that brings us to Scorp. So Scorp has his regenerative toxin. This is his healing sig. So Scorp, he will heal a portion of the damage taken from non-special attacks when he has his venom charges. Now, he does have to have venom charges, but those, of course, are very easy to get. You're gaining one every time you get a bar of power. You can expend those venom charges with your heavies and your special too, but you're always going to be able to get them back. You're always going to be able to build them up. And so the healing is going to trigger very, very frequently. Now, obviously, in one sense, it's a circumstantial sig because you have to get hit in order to heal. On the other hand, though, it's extremely reliable because every time you have venom charges, you take any damage from a non-special, you're going to recover health. So it's going to help you out, it's going to save you, and it's a good sig for not only newer players, but also for experienced players. Certainly for newer players because you're going to get hit more often, but I know people who use Scorp in things like high-level AMs, LOC fights, and it's just a nice safety net because you're going to get tagged sometimes, even if you're a great player, and it can certainly help you out, and you can recover a real amount of health. So at Sig 1, he's getting about 31% regeneration. That goes up to 65% at Sig 100, so it roughly doubles. The good thing about this is that even at low Sig, he's healing a lot. Low Sig, he's getting 30 to 40% regeneration. That's quite a lot. So you don't have to get him to very high Sig in order to be able to get some pretty meaningful healing. That's what I really like about it, okay? And it's just, like I said, it's extremely reliable. Now, obviously, if you're the kind of player that you're an absolute ninja, you almost never get hit, well, then you might not want to worry about it too much. But for the majority of players, it's an excellent sig that will trigger very often and lead to very meaningful healing, even at lower sig. So that brings us to Drift. So Deep Focus is his sig. Now his is a very circumstantial sig because Deep Focus activates based upon the combo meter. It only kicks in at 15 hits. So it has some similar characteristics to Deep Wounds. To Starseeker, but also to Deep Wounds. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's similar to Starseeker in that it activates at 15 hits. And if you get hit after that, you lose it. You can get it again, but you have to be mindful of that. And so with Drift, there's a couple of prerequisites in order to really benefit from his sig. Number one, it's not so useful in very short fights because a lot of fights aren't long enough to even see his sig activate, or maybe only see it activate for a few seconds. It's definitely more useful in mid-length fights and longer fights. The second thing that's more important is that you have to be a pretty good player, right? A lot of very skilled high-level players love Drift and use him well and get a lot of benefit from his sig because if you're not getting hit much, well, the nice thing about his sig in that case is that you can theoretically apply it permanently. If you're in a long fight, you get Deep Focus, you don't get hit again, his sig is going to be active the rest of the fight, right? But you have to be a good enough player in order to derive benefit from it, okay? So with his sig, he is getting 50% increased bleed duration. So those enhanced bleeds at Sig 1. At Sig 100, that goes up to 150% increased bleed duration. Okay, so we're talking about significantly longer bleeds. Drift is obviously a major bleed bot, bleeds a ton. Bleeds are very important to his kit, just like with a lot of the warriors. And as it relates to Deep Wounds, his sig is basically a stronger version of Deep Wounds. So Deep Wounds is similar, right? But that maxes out at 30%. If you have Deep Wounds maxed out, you're getting 30% increased duration of bleeds. Drift is getting 50% even at Sig 1. And so, by the way, if you're using Drift with his sig and Deep Wounds, we're talking about incredibly long bleeds, particularly, by the way, when we're talking about his special 2 and 3, which have those epic 10-second bleeds, which are incredibly long. So if you're a really good player, you don't get hit much, you like bleed bots, you use Deep Wounds, you're going to get a ton of benefit from his sig. And no, you also don't actually have to get his sig that high because even at low sig, you're getting 50+% increased bleed duration. Obviously, if you're a ninja, you love Drift, by all means invest in his sig, and you can see some of the most phenomenal bleed damage you've ever seen if he's at high sig. But he doesn't actually need to be high sig. You just have to be mindful of the fact that it is a circumstantial sig. It's best for mid-length fights or longer, and you have to be a good enough player to not lose it over and over again, because if you're still getting hit a lot, you're either almost never going to activate the sig, or even if you do, you're going to lose it quickly. So you just have to be mindful of that. So that brings us to Bonecrusher. So his sig is Pure Hate. It's a simple sig, often overlooked because not a lot of people use BC, but it's actually a very good sig because it activates all the time. Pure Hate is directly tied to Bonecrusher's bleeds, and of course BC is all about the bleeds as well. He bleeds with a lot of his attacks. He also bleeds on the opponent when he is struck by melees most of the time, and so his sig works directly with his bleeds. So on bleeding opponents, he will see an increase in attack and power rate, and then the opponents go down. So the opponent's attack and power rate go down by the same amount. So it's nice because it affects you, the player, and the opponent at the same time. At Sig 1, he is getting a 16% attack boost and a 7% increased power rate. At Sig 100, the power rate goes up by up to 30%. It is only the power that's affected by high Sig. But here's the thing. He is getting those bonuses per stack of bleed. So if you have 2 stacks of bleed, 3 stacks of bleed, which if you know how to play BC well, you're going to get multiple stacks of bleed pretty often. If you have, let's say, 3 stacks of bleed, he's getting almost 50% increased attack and over 20% increased power. So the fact that it's only the power rate that goes up at high Sig is actually fine because it's a nice attack boost no matter what. You can multiply it with multiple stacks of bleed, and remember that the opponents are going down by the same amount. So you can significantly reduce the opponent's attack and power rate at low or high Sig. So it's not the kind of Sig you need to invest a lot into. You certainly can if you want, but he's going to do just fine with low Sig because, like I said, it's going to trigger every single time the opponent is bleeding, and you're going to get a benefit as the player, and the opponent is going to be penalized at the same time. So next up we have Hound. So Hound has his Warrior Ballerina roll. So his triggers every time he does that roll to avoid ranged attacks. When he does that roll, he gets a ranged bonus for 5 seconds. Okay, so it's similar to Dirges in the sense that it's a bonus for 5 seconds, but again, you can get it over and over again because you're going to be evading and dodging attacks a lot. You know, the opponents are throwing range shots at you all the time. You learn how to do that roll well. You're going to be able to activate this Sig pretty frequently. At Sig 1, Hound is getting a 50% range damage boost. That goes up to 200% at Sig 100. So it does scale. It's quite a noticeable difference. Now, of course, not a lot of people use Hound either, but if you really love that ranged game of his, which is where he really shines, it would certainly be worth investing in because you'd be looking at a massive increase in range damage if you were to get him up to even, let's say, mid-level Sig. The nice thing, though, is that even at low Sig, it's a nice boost, and because you can get it over and over again, you know, you could really ramp up that extra damage if you're able to activate that Sig over and over. So definitely the kind of Sig that will be very worthwhile if you like Hound's play style because it will activate very often and it does scale quite well. So that brings us to Arcee. So her Sig is Guardian's Ferocity, and her Sig gives her a chance at a precision buff with her special attacks. So her Sig is triggered by specials, okay? The thing about Arcee Sig is that it is entirely RNG based, okay? So that precision buff does 2 things. Number 1, it increases her crit rate by 25%. Number 2, it applies anti-evasion for 10 seconds on the opponent. It's a good anti-evade. The only downside is the precision is never guaranteed. So at Sig 1, she's getting about a 42%, I believe it's 41.8% chance to get that precision buff with her specials. That goes up to 80% at Sig 100, so it does not scale well. It doesn't even quite double, okay? What that means is that you'd have to be a very die-hard Arcee player in order to maximize her Sig because it would take a long time, and even at Sig 100, it's only an 80% chance to activate precision. With that said, Arcee has some of the best power flow in the game. She's using more specials than most other bots, and so, you know, given how many specials she can use, and given that at low Sig, she's still getting a 40 to 50% chance for precision, which means you are still going to be getting it with some consistency. You just can't control it. So as long as you're okay with that, as long as you're okay with the fact that it's not going to activate it all the time, some fights it won't activate at all, you know, it's definitely a roll of the dice every time, but it will be helpful to you sometimes. Anti-evasion is good. increased crit rate is good. And I should mention, she did get a buff several months ago in which the precision chance does go up with her special 2 and 3. So now there's an increased chance of 10% with her special 2 and 20% with her special 3. So if you had her at Sig 1, it would be a 52% chance to activate precision with her special 2, and it would be 62% with her special 3. That does help. So it's an RNG Sig, but it's a good Sig when it activates. So that brings us to Hot Rod. So Hot Rod, his Sig is acceleration. It's a simple Sig, has 2 components as well. Okay? It will increase power flow, and it will give him a chance to evade ranged attacks with his specials. So it works in a similar way to Arcee's in that it triggers with special attacks. However, with Hot Rod, unlike Arcee, is that it is guaranteed to actually trigger even at Sig 1. So the evade range chance is 30% regardless of Sig level, but the power flow changes. At Sig 1, he's getting 60% increased power flow. It goes up to 120% at Sig 100, so it basically doubles. This is actually a good thing because it means you really don't need to invest very much in his Sig, because even 60% is a lot. That significantly increased power flow. Power flow leads to more specials, so forth and so on. On top of that, acceleration does work indirectly with deceleration, which of course is the most important part of his kit. He is the anti-evade bot. You know, he's kind of the go-to for a lot of people. And it does work with deceleration because the increased power flow will lead to more specials. And he lands longer periods of deceleration with the special 2 and 3. So in an indirect way, the acceleration can sort of be paired with his deceleration. And so it's a nice Sig because you don't have to invest in it much. You're going to get that evade range chance regardless, and he's going to get pretty nice increased power flow even at low Sig. You'd only really want to invest a lot in his Sig if he was, one of your absolute top bots and you used him all the time. So finally, that brings us to Bludgeon. So he has Metallicato. He has an unusual Sig because it triggers in an unusual way. So Bludgeon, his Sig will trigger when he misses with melee attacks. Okay? That's interesting. When he misses, his crit damage increases significantly on his next critical attack. Okay? So he misses with a melee. The next time he crits, at Sig 5, I don't have the info for Sig 1, but at Sig 5, he gets roughly a 94% crit damage boost on the next crit. That goes up to 270% at Sig 100. It's quite a lot. It scales, and it's a very sizable boost in that crit damage. However, there's a few things to think about, okay? It's a circumstantial Sig for sure. Number one, it's based upon you missing attacks. Okay? Less experienced players are going to miss a lot more often, so they're going to get a lot of benefit from the Sig. Really experienced players who are masters with Bludgeon are still going to miss sometimes, so it will still activate occasionally, but it really depends on your playstyle, how good you are, etc., etc. So how often it activates really will just depend. At the same time, even though it is a very large crit damage boost, the thing about it, though, is that it is RNG based in the sense that you cannot choose when you're going to crit next, right? You can't pick what hit that's going to be. So if his Sig activates and then you hit the opponent with a melee, you'll get that crit damage boost, but it might not be that big of a hit. However, if the Sig activates and then you land a special and it crits, that's going to be potentially a really big hit and might do a ton of damage. So you have to be okay with the fact that you're not going to be able to control when that extra crit damage actually happens because you don't know when you're going to crit next. There is a lot of RNG based into it. With that said, even at low Sig, you're getting, roughly 100% additional crit damage on that next hit. And if you're missing attacks even relatively often, which even very experienced players will sometimes, it could activate a lot depending. And honestly, Bludgeon Sig will be best against evade bots because you're going to be missing more often against bots like Sideswipe, Tac B, Scout B, Barricade, bots that evade a lot because Bludgeon has no anti-evade of his own. You're going to see a lot more activation of his Sig, and on top of that, again, a lot of people don't use Bludgeon, but if you were using him, you ranked him up, you paired him with, let's say, Sword Masters, it could be a very useful sig for the right kind of player in the right kind of circumstances. So it's a very circumstantial sig, but it is a very sizable increase in that crit damage. It will activate often in some fights. You just won't get to choose where that crit damage lands, what hit it's going to be. So it's an interesting sig, and it is unusual. So that wraps up the warrior class. I just want to give you a few things then to think about when you're pouring sigs into your bots, because as you know, they're incredibly difficult to get. It's mostly going to be through duping bots, which of course you can't really choose when you're opening crystals, of course, and through the buying of bots, Titan bots, and buying featured bots, you're going to be getting some sigs. So you have to be very careful because it's a very slow process. So what I would say is the most important consideration is you want to be feeding sigs into bots that you use a lot, that you play well with, and that work in the teams that you use, because you're going to be building teams. That is critical. Please do not feed sigs into bots because somebody else told you their sig is good, or somebody else said that their sig is awesome, so you should use them. Because you do not want to be pouring a lot of sigs into a bot you barely ever play with, or that you're not good with. It's not about anybody else, it's about you, okay? So you want to have your core bots, right? The bots that you play really well with, that you play a lot with. That's the most important thing, okay? By the way, if you're still building your roster, if you're not sure yet who you play the best with, then save your sigs. You don't have to feed them to anybody right away. You can store them, you can save them, and then make an informed decision once you're sure about the bots that you play the most with and that you really want to feed those sigs to. Once you have those top bots, though, I would do a couple of things. Number one, I would focus on one bot at a time per class. You don't want to be spreading out too many sigs all over the place, because then you're not going to have any bots with very high sig. You want to focus on one bot per class in most cases. That's really, really important. And it's also really important then, therefore, once you have those top bots in your mind and you're sure about the bots that you're thinking of investing in, you want to think about the things that I just went over in relation to things like activation rate, right? Because generally you want to start with bots that have signatures that are going to activate pretty frequently and pretty easily, okay? Because bots that have sigs that only activate once, like let's say MV1 or an Ironhide, or that require you to lose health, like a Motor Master, it doesn't mean that their sigs aren't good or useful. It just means that you want to make sure that you're feeding sigs into bots that are actually going to benefit you over and over again. Because maybe you use a bot like MV1 where it only activates once for a brief duration of time. You can still use him, but maybe you don't want to feed your sigs to him. Maybe you want to feed those sigs to a different brawler, maybe your number 2 brawler, right? So you want to be thinking about the sig itself apart from the bot, because there are excellent bots that don't have the most worthwhile sigs. There are also bots that aren't quite as good, or maybe that you don't play as well with, that have really good sigs. So you have to think about that as well. And so if you do all of that, you have a strategy involved, then you're not going to be wasting sigs, and you're not going to end up regretting pouring a bunch of sigs into a bot or two that you barely ever use, okay? So I hope this has been helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. I will make videos for the other classes over the next couple of weeks. Until we speak again, take care of yourselves, and we will speak again soon.